It was just another late shift at the diner, the kind of night where you could hear the hum of the fridge over the soft clink of cups and plates. I've worked at this place for about 2 years now, and usually, it's a quiet gig. The occasional drunk person comes in, orders greasy food to sober up, and leaves without a fuss. Tonight felt like one of those nights. At least it started that way. It was around midnight when the door jingled and a guy walked in. He looked off. Not in a scary way, just like someone who hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled and his hair looked like it hadn't seen a comb in a while. But it wasn't just his appearance. It was how he acted. He sat at a booth near the window, staring at the empty seat across from him. I figured he was waiting for someone, maybe a friend or girlfriend, so I didn't think much of it. People come and go at all hours in this business. After a few minutes, I went over to take his order. "Hey, what can I get you?" I asked, standing there with my notepad. Not that I needed it. Most people at this hour just ordered coffee or something easy. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he was talking, but not to me. He was looking at the empty seat, nodding his head as if someone was sitting there chatting away. I stood there for a second, a bit confused but also not wanting to be rude. Sir?" I tried again. Finally he looked at me but only for a second before glancing back at the empty seat. "Just a coffee," he muttered. His voice was quiet, shaky. It sounded like he hadn't spoken in a while, like the words were difficult for him. "All right, one coffee coming up," I replied, still trying to brush off the weirdness of the whole thing. I expected him to pay and leave, but instead, he pulled out a small piece of paper from his pocket. He slid it across the counter to me without a word. I picked it up and saw a series of numbers scribbled on it, nothing else. No explanation, no message, just a string of random digits. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. He looked at me for a brief moment, his eyes almost sad, like he knew something I didn't. "You'll figure it out," he muttered, before turning and walking out the door. I stood there holding the paper, more confused than ever. I mean, what was I supposed to do with it? I glanced over at Tom, who was still sitting there, staring at his phone. "You think this means anything?" I asked, showing him the slip of paper. Tom barely looked up. "Nah, probably some drunk guy messing with you." I nodded, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. I folded the paper and stuffed it in my pocket, figuring I'd just throw it away later. The rest of the shift went by quietly. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. Tom's car was still in the parking lot, but he wasn't around. I figured he must have stepped outside for a smoke, but when I checked the lot, he wasn't there. His car was locked and his phone was still on the counter inside the diner. I called out his name a few times, but he didn't answer. By the time my shift ended, I was feeling uneasy. Tom was nowhere to be found and I couldn't figure out why he'd leave without his car or phone. I even tried calling him, but his phone just rang and rang, sitting right where he'd left it. I went home, telling myself he probably just caught a ride with someone and forgot his stuff, but something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't stop thinking about that weird guy with the slip of paper. And what did he mean, "you'll figure it out"? The next few days were normal enough, but Tom didn't show up for his shifts and no one could reach him. The manager was getting pissed, thinking he'd just ditched the job without a word. But I knew Tom better than that. He wouldn't just leave like that, not without his stuff. Then, a few days later, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was getting ready for my shift, grabbing my uniform from my locker when I saw something fall out. It was that same slip of paper, the one with the string of numbers on it. I could have sworn I'd left it in my pocket or thrown it out, but here it was, lying at the bottom of my locker. My hand started to shake as I picked it up. The numbers were the same, but now they felt more ominous, like they were staring back at me. I didn't know what they meant, but something inside me screamed that I needed to get out of there. I quit that day, told the manager I couldn't work the night shift anymore. He thought I was being dramatic, but I didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen if I stayed. It's been a few weeks since then, and I still haven't heard from Tom. His car is still parked outside the diner, covered in dust now. The police said they're looking into it, but they don't have any leads. They keep asking if I noticed anything strange that night, but I can't bring myself to tell them about the guy with the numbers. They wouldn't believe me anyway. Every now and then I dream about that diner. I see Tom sitting at the counter scrolling through his phone, and that guy whispering to someone who isn't there. And in every dream, I wake up just as he slides that slip of paper across the counter to me. I've been a cook at this 24-hour diner for nearly 5 years now. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. And most of the time it's pretty quiet. especially when you work the late shift like I do. You get the occasional drunk or tired trucker passing through, but for the most part it's just me, the waitress, and the regulars who come in after midnight. It started like any other late night shift. I came in at 10 p.m., put on my apron and started prepping the kitchen for the night. Cindy, our night shift waitress, was already there, wiping down the counter and making small talk with an old regular named Lou. Lou's a trucker who stops by whenever he's passing through. He's quiet but friendly, always orders the same thing: coffee, black, and a club sandwich with extra mayo. Around midnight things were still pretty dead. I had just finished up an order for a couple of teenagers who had come in for burgers when the door jingled and in walked this couple. Right away I could tell something was off. They didn't look like the usual late-night crowd. The guy was tall, heavy-set, wearing a leather jacket, and he had this intense look on his face like he was pissed at the world. The woman with him was the complete opposite. Small, frail-looking, with long dark hair that hung over her face like she was trying to hide behind it. She kept her head down the whole time, barely making eye contact with anyone. Cindy greeted them with her usual smile and tried to make small talk, but the guy wasn't having any of it. He just grunted and said something under his breath, real aggressive. The woman, she didn't say a word, just stood there, clutching her purse like her life depended on it. They sat down in one of the booths near the back, the farthest one from the door. I could see them through the little window in the kitchen where we hand off the food. The guy was leaning in close to her, talking fast and low. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but whatever it was making her uncomfortable. She looked terrified. Cindy walked over to take their order, and that's when things got weird. The guy barked out his order, something like a steak and eggs, but the woman didn't order anything. Cindy asked her a couple of times if she wanted anything, but she just shook her head. The guy got pissed, slammed his fist on the table, and told her to order something. She stammered out a request for a glass of water, and that was it. I started cooking up the steak and eggs, but I couldn't stop watching them. The guy kept looking around the diner like he was checking to see if anyone was paying attention to him. Every time Cindy or I walked past, he'd stop talking and just glare at us. The woman, though, she kept her eyes glued to the table, hands trembling. It was like she was too scared to even move. By this point, Lou had noticed too. He kept glancing over at the booth from his spot at the counter, frowning. Lou's one of those guys who's seen a lot in his time on the road, but I'd never seen him look this concerned before. When I handed off the food to Cindy, I made sure to look over at the couple again. The guy was practically shoveling the food into his mouth, barely chewing. The woman still hadn't touched her water. That's when Lou stood up. I don't know what made him do it, but he walked over to their booth, coffee cup in hand, and said something to the guy. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but whatever it was, it didn't go over well. The guy shot up from his seat, towering over Lou, and started yelling. The whole diner went dead quiet. Cindy froze in place, holding a coffee pot, not knowing what to do. The woman just shrank back into the corner of the booth, eyes wide like she was trying to disappear. Lou didn't back down though. He kept his cool, stood his ground, and said something else. The guy was fuming, but then something changed. He stopped mid-rant, glared at the woman, then looked back at Lou. Without another word, he grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the booth. The woman stumbled as he pulled her toward the door, but she didn't resist. She just let him yank her out of the diner, looking back at us with this desperate, pleading expression. I'll never forget that look. It was like she was begging for help, but too scared to say anything. Once they were gone, the diner was dead silent. Cindy finally breathed again and walked over to Lou, asking if he was okay. Lou just shook his head and sat back down at the counter, looking real troubled. "They're gone," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We thought that was the end of it. Weird encounter, but people are strange sometimes. Then, about 10 minutes later, we heard sirens. They were faint at first, but they kept getting louder until they were right outside the diner. 2 cop cars screeched to a stop in the parking lot, lights flashing. Cindy and I rushed to the window, watching as the officers got out and started looking around. One of them came inside and asked us if we'd seen a man and a woman. Cindy pointed out that they had just left a few minutes ago. The cop nodded, looking real serious, and asked us if we had seen the car they were driving. Lou chimed in from the counter. They walked out. Didn't see a car. That's when the cop's face went pale. He radioed something to the others, and they started searching the parking lot. After a few minutes, one of them shouted, and we saw them looking inside a beat-up old car parked near the dumpsters in the back. The cop who had been talking to us cursed under his breath and asked us to come outside. Turns out the car was stolen, had been reported missing earlier that day from a gas station 2 towns over. They ran the plates and everything. The strange thing was, The car had been sitting there for hours, which didn't make sense because we didn't see them drive up. They just walked in like they had come from somewhere nearby. The cops took our statements, asked us about the couple, and then left to continue their search. The whole thing left us all feeling uneasy. Cindy was shaken up, kept saying how weird the whole night had been. Lou just sat there, staring into his coffee like he was trying to figure out what had just happened. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, the way she looked at us before she left like she was trapped. The cops never found them, or at least if they did, we didn't hear about it. I kept checking the news for days, looking for any mention of them, but there was nothing. No missing persons report, no follow-up on the stolen car. It was like they vanished. The whole thing still haunts me. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was something more we could have done. Lou says we did all we could, but I'm not so sure. I can't shake the feeling that something terrible happened to that woman, something we couldn't see or understand. It was a Wednesday, I think. The clock read close to 2 a.m., and the diner was completely empty. I had the radio on low, just some random talk show in the background, and I was wiping down the counter to kill time. My boss didn't really care if I listened to the radio as long as I got the cleaning done, and honestly, it helped keep me awake during the slow hours. I was about halfway through wiping the tables when the bell above the door jingled. It startled me a bit because it had been so quiet, but I didn't think much of it at first. We get all kinds of people coming through, especially this late. I looked up and saw this guy walking in. He looked off. Not like he was drunk or anything, but just kind of strange. He wore an old brown coat and his hair was a bit messy. He had this weird blank look on his face, like he wasn't really there. I gave him the usual greeting, "Hey, welcome in, just grab a seat wherever you like." He didn't say anything, just kind of nodded and walked slowly over to one of the booths near the window. He sat down without even glancing at the menu, just staring out the window into the darkness. Now that in itself wasn't too weird. We get people in here who just want to sit for a bit, especially if they've been driving a long time. But this guy, there was something about him that made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off and headed over to his booth with my notepad. "Can I get you something to drink to start?" I asked, figuring he'd want coffee like most people this late. Without looking at me, he said, "Coffee and a burger. Simple enough, right?" But the way he said it was strange, flat, emotionless, like he wasn't even thinking about what he was saying. "Sure thing," I said, trying to keep things casual. "You want fries with that?" "No, just the burger." "Okay, coming right up." I went back behind the counter, poured him a cup of coffee, and put the order in for the burger. While I waited for the grill to cook, I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move, didn't touch the coffee, didn't even glance around the diner, just kept staring out the window like he was waiting for something. The burger was done in a few minutes and I brought it over to him. "Here you go, burger and coffee. Let me know if you need anything else." He didn't say thank you or anything, he just muttered, "It's not ready yet," and kept staring out the window. I was confused. The burger's right there, I just made it fresh." He didn't respond, didn't even look at me, he just kept repeating, "It's not ready yet." I didn't know what to say, so I just backed off and went back to cleaning. Every now and then, I glanced over to see if he'd touched his food or coffee, but he hadn't. The burger sat there, untouched, and the coffee was still full. The minutes dragged on. It was probably about 30 minutes later when I noticed something weird. The guy was still sitting in the same position, staring out the window, but the food and coffee were gone. Like, completely gone. The plate was empty, and the coffee cup was bone dry, as if nothing had been in it to begin with. I didn't see him eat or drink anything, and I definitely didn't hear the door open for him to leave. The diner is small, there's no way I could have missed it. I walked over to the booth, feeling uneasy. You all set here?" I asked, half expecting him to still be sitting there. But the booth was empty, no sign of the guy, and no sign that he'd even been there. The plate was clean, the cup was dry, and the booth looked like it hadn't been touched. I glanced around the diner, checking the bathrooms, but there was no one. It was just me. I stood there for a minute, staring at the empty booth, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Maybe he'd left and I hadn't noticed? But there's no way I wouldn't have seen or heard him leave. It's not like I was distracted, I was just cleaning. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I was just tired or zoning out. I went back to the counter and sat down, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to 3 a.m. But something was still bothering me. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. The way he looked, the way he talked, how he said the food wasn't ready yet, and the way the food and coffee just disappeared. None of it made any sense. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. Every time the bell above the door jingled, I half expected to see that guy walking back in, but he never did. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my stuff and headed out to my car. The parking lot was empty and the cold night air felt heavy. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the wind and the faint hum of the highway in the distance. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove home, trying to push the whole thing out of my mind. But even after I got home and crawled into bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that guy's face, blank and emotionless, staring out the window. The next day, when I went back to work, I told my coworker about what happened. He just laughed it off, saying it was probably just some weirdo passing through. But I could tell he didn't believe me, not really. And honestly, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. I worked the next few nights without any incident, but I never felt comfortable after that. Every time someone walked in, I tensed up, waiting for something strange to happen. But nothing ever did. It was just regular customers, ordering regular food, acting normal. Still, that one night stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I finally decided to check the security cameras. We had them set up around the diner, mainly to catch people skipping out on their checks. I wasn't really expecting to find anything, but I had to see for myself if the guy had really been there or if I'd somehow imagined the whole thing. I fast-forwarded through the footage of that night, watching myself clean tables, take orders, and serve food, and then I saw him. The guy in the brown coat walking into the diner and sitting in the booth by the window. I watched myself walk over and take his order just like I remembered. But here's the thing, after I served him the food, something strange happened. He didn't move. He didn't touch the food, didn't drink the coffee just like I remembered. But as I fast-forwarded through the footage, something was missing. There was no moment where he got up to leave. 1 second he was there, and the next the booth was empty, the food and coffee gone. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over again, trying to figure out what happened. But it was the same every time. The guy just vanished, and the food disappeared along with him.